Good afternoon, folks. This is round two of the Ungovernables 2021 live stream for November 28th, no matter what you see on this date. This is Sunday night stream on Monday because we had technical difficulties. So without further ado, I'm going to kick this baby right off.
Because when we don't do it right 10,000 times, we're never going to not do it right 10,000 times, but we'll do it another time. That's one of the things from Miss Elizabeth Holmes. That's a quote from Edison. When you don't do it right 10,000 times, you get it right on the 10,001st. Well, she didn't do it 10,000 times anyway. She did it one time. That's part of the problem. So we're going to do this again, and I'm going to start by saying this whole thing has a theme, and it's about how you question and how you process information like this, how you look at a service. This is a service called Theranos that she started up in 2003. So this was a service that she created to draw blood. So let's say you're going to a Walgreens, and this was a service that said that they're going to take a pinprick of your blood, and it's going to be so much easier and blah, blah, blah. You get there, and they get a tourniquet and a syringe out, and you're like, wait, what happens? What do you do? Do you just say, okay? Do you walk out? It's part of what we're going to be talking about, because people tend to just go with things and trust those in power or those who are giving you a service. And I'm going to focus mostly on pre-trial. This is pre-trial. This is history of Theranos. I'm focusing mostly on the reporting of it and some of the subjects of the reporting. Obviously, Elizabeth Holmes, her number two's Ramesh Sunny Balwani, but some of the players that were involved in propping her up, whether it be her board or her investors, which there were a lot of, or the people who eventually took her down, which were the whistleblowers, including from the very beginning, her professor who told her technology was not going to work, which was Phyllis Gardner. So let's start this thing. I suggest to you all, there are plenty of documentaries out there. If you guys want to know more about this, watch this documentary. A lot of what I'm going to talk about is in here. It's called The Inventor Out for Blood in Silicon Valley. It's written by Alex Gibney. He's a documentarian that has done a lot of stuff, and he does a very good job here. It's very balanced. It's not rah-rah. It's not for her. It's not really, it just presents the information, and it goes through the process. I think this process of investigating is pretty much threefold, at least pre-trial. It is the promotion of her, it is the investigation of her, and then it's the exposure of her. And I think that there are three reporters that pretty much represent this. First is Roger Parloff. Now, this is his initial report, and it's pretty much a promotion piece. And he was very impressed by her. He introduced her to a bunch of people, had a Blue Cross Blue Shield, bunch of people, a professional photographer. They took hundreds of photos of her, promoted her, and Fortune magazine, because they were focusing pretty much on the money part of it and how much she generated, and also the power of her board, which included Henry Kissinger, George Shultz, whose grandson eventually worked for the company and it became a thing. He actually became a whistleblower. Sam Nunn, all of these very powerful people. She interviewed with Bill Clinton, with, at the time, Vice President Joe Biden. She became a big deal. And this article helped promote her, helped to start her career. Now, this was in June 12th, 2014. This is after she got the contract for Walgreens. So this was after all of the services were already in place. So he's promoting her, talking about when she met with her chemical engineering professor, Channing Robinson, who basically one of Elizabeth Holmes' advisors, which we're going to be talking about a lot, actually, Phyllis Gardner, brought her to him thinking that he might talk some sense into her, and he became part of her board as an advisor because he was so smitten by her or whatever, by her sales pitch. And all of this is sales pitch.
And by the way, an awful lot of rich, white, and older men were smitten by her.
Yeah.
As you will see by her board.
Right. And we'll get to the board in a minute. This was after the investigation in the exposure part. Roger Parloff did not do his due diligence. There were a couple of things that he just assumed were true that he later on found out were not. One, that she used only her proprietary machines, which for the most part didn't work anyway. She used third-party machines, which she denied up and down until she was exposed. And then the second one was the blood part. He caught very early on, Roger Parloff caught on very early on that most of the tests were venous tests. And her whole pitch was that she wanted a smaller machine eventually that would be in every home where you could just draw your own blood with a pinprick instead of taking a tourniquet and a syringe. And he asked about it, and she said something about, well, we have to take care of the volume. And he was like, what? He didn't go any further. But then as this whole thing moved on, and especially after the Carreyrou article, he understood. She always talked about trade secrets. And then when Carreyrou's articles, there were two articles that came out in October of 2015, then Roger Parloff actually said, okay, this is a different kind of secret. We're not talking about trade secrets anymore. We're basically talking about lies and fraud. So
let me just interject one thing here.
Yeah.
And I agree with Roger Parloff that she misled him, but let this be a point. It is the responsibility of the reporter or the investigative journalist to question everything, whether or not she's impressive or whether she isn't.
Right.
Particularly when you're talking about something that is technology driven and looks too good to be true. And this is exactly what this was. The notion that you could take a bunch of tests and instead of drawing 4 vials of blood, that you could take this little tiny little tube with a pinprick on it, stick it in your finger, take, I don't know, a little teeny bit of blood and run all of those tests from that. That is something that should have been, when she didn't answer the questions, That's something that should have raised alarms for him.
Now, initially, I will say, and he says in here, the title is a little misleading because he does do a full mea culpa. He said, "Look, I would have loved to say that it was all Elizabeth Holmes, but no, it wasn't me. I blew it. I did poor reporting on this story. I should have gone farther with it." And he goes into that. So he did a full mea culpa on it. Also, he testified in the trial, and he gave all of the tapes, all of the notes, all of that. The funny thing is that he actually helped her to prominence with this article. It gave a lot of opportunities for her on television and other things, including the next reporter that we're going to talk about. But then the defense lawyers tried to attack his reporting, which
I'm sure he knew was going to happen. He did. You had to know it. They were attacking the investors. So, he had to know that was going to come up. He's not stupid, this guy.
Right. He asked about the Venus test, but he felt he didn't press hard enough. That was the one main thing that he was like, I had it and I blew it.
Right.
So, the statement went on to address my following question, which was basically, if you were capable of doing 200 plus tests using your proprietary methods, why weren't you in fact doing them? So this is the reply. Over time, we've been optimizing our clinical lab to bring up tests that are more commonly ordered, and in some cases move resources off the proprietary tests that are commonly ordered to get to a point where the ordering patterns we are seeing can all be accommodated through our finger stick technology. So maybe he was hypnotized by that. He basically said, "Got that?" So so he looked back and he said, "All right, I blew this." But again, the part of this is people make mistakes, and as Dr. Phyllis Gardner from Stanford University, Holmes's advisor at Stanford, who told her that the machine wouldn't work, says that everybody makes mistakes, but you just own up to them. That's going to be another theme of this. So from this story, we get Mr. Oletta, Mr. Ken Oletta, who writes a story called Blood Simpler. And he delves a little farther. He gets into some of the fluff stuff, which is, her family history. By the way, her family, it was involved in government, did important things. Her father worked for the NSAID, which is an international governmental department. And he works in water protection. Her mother worked for the
EPA. I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, worked for the State Department. So, it was like she wanted to change the world in a big way and all of that stuff. She wanted her legacy. They talk later on, we talk about noble cause corruption, which is actually a term, but I think that disintegrates once you start causing massive fraud that actually affects patients. Once she went live with her testing with Walgreens, all of that was out the window, and this was already so.
And by the way, once you start flat out fucking lying, that benevolence shit goes away.
Right. Which she started to do, especially right after the Wall Street Journal reporting. She goes right on their show and flat out lies. So Ken Oletta did some of that, did some of the, hey, she does this and that, but he does a little bigger digging, and says that, wait a minute, I need to see the machines. I want to know something about the pharmaceutical companies you claim to have worked with, the governmental contracts. I just need I don't need to know what they are. If they're classified, I understand, but I need to know. And she's always like, trade secrets. It's, whatever, classified. She did a couple of things. Elizabeth Holmes posted under Bill Matt or Mad Dog Mattis's profile that they were doing work with the government, which was patently not true. She also, to get donors in, like ironically Rupert Murdoch or Betsy DeVos, those people, she forged document, or didn't forge documents. She erroneously put stamps of companies, Pfizer, and what was the other company? Schering. Yeah.
Schering Cloud. She put their logos
on the documents, which implied that they were part of this, which they weren't at all.
By the way, you will find out when you read the material we put in here that neither Pfizer nor Schering Plough were impressed with what they saw when they went into when they spoke with her. They weren't so smitten.
The whole part of this too is that when she speaks and she does her pitch, which is described as the carpet part of the operation, she wows people. But when you get to the practical part, or the tile part, or what they call the tile part of it, the lab part, everything falls apart. Once the FDA gets involved, the CMS, which is a Medicare and Medicaid agency, everything falls apart.
She's great on paper.
Right.
But that's it.
I recommend that you listen to this. This is a podcast that John Carreyrou actually hosts. He talks to Ken Auletta and talks about it. He actually talks about the mistakes that Roger Parloff actually did, which were the two big ones that, he made assertive statements instead of just questioning it and saying that instead of Elizabeth Holmes claims this, that Elizabeth Holmes does this, particularly with these 70 lab tests, and Roger Parloff, he admits it. He admits that he blew it with that. But Ken Auletta goes deeper, and Ken Auletta actually gave John Carreyrou all of his tapes. And John Carreyrou actually goes through all of his investigation. Also says that part of what John did, John Carreyrou, he actually read the Ken Auletta interview. He read the piece. And then on top of that, one of his sources calls him up and says, "Hey, did you read this Ken Auletta piece?" And John Carreyrou said, "Yeah, I did." And in the piece, in the Ken Auletta piece, Ken Auletta talks about the description of the technology itself, which was, in Ken Auletta's words, comically vague, which set off an alarm bell to begin with. And then one of John Carreyrou's sources said, "Hey, there is a lab tech that left on very bad terms. His name is Tyler Schultz. You might want to talk to him," because he had serious concerns about the lab and what they were doing and all of that, which really piqued his interest. He had just gotten off a story about Medicare fraud, John Carreyrou did, and he was looking for another story. And this was like, yeah, I'm on this. I don't know if John Carreyrou realized how on it he would have to be. He focused on that on the Theranos story for 3 years. So then it just generated, it was a gift that kept on giving. And I'll get to that.
Kind of like the religious right.
Right. So this is the first story. So this was October 15th and October 16th. So I'm not going to go too much into this because this is actually part of a subscription. But what I will say is that he breaks this all down, basically exposing a lot of it. He talks to the professor who basically says that there was no way that the machine would ever work. He talks to some of the people who used to work at Theranos who basically broke this down. There were three main issues. That, number one, they use third-party machines. Number two, that, and this was the big one, that the tests that they ran on their machine was highly inaccurate. And number three, there were very few out of all the tests that they claimed to do. They use their machine for like 15 of them out of like, whatever it was, 200. They had a menu. They had a menu that they had to order off of. One other thing, he does go into it. There was a bill introduced and lobbied by Elizabeth Holmes and in a state to allow people to just order their own labs without medical consultation, which in my opinion is highly dangerous, especially when the labs are faulty. I'm not going to know. It got so bad at one point that you had Theranos lab technicians calling patients up saying they had to go to the emergency room when they didn't.
Right.
You had one woman who got a wildly wrong blood test that said that her estrogen level was off the chain, through the roof, and it wasn't.
No, and the backstory to that is that she had breast cancer, and that elevated estrogen level for her age group would have indicated that her breast cancer was back, and it wasn't. So these are all of the things that, it may have been good news at the end that it wasn't back and the test was faulty, but these are the things that cause stress. These are the things that that should not be happening with a medical company.
Right. Now, one thing I want to say, I didn't put them up on the screen, but I implore you, if you are interested in this story, we're going to put in the references or in the sources some video. She is highly visual, so there's a visual, like 2-minute TED Talk of Elizabeth Holmes with her headset on and her sales pitch and all of that. You'll see
her best imitation of
Steve Jobs.
Steve Jobs.
She also named her machine the Edison after Thomas Edison, Thomas Alva Edison, which Steve Jobs and Thomas Alva Edison talk about fake it till you make it. Well, again, in medicine, you can't do that, especially when you go live and you're affecting patients.
And the reason you fake it till you make it is so they can raise more money for their business. That's the way you do it. It's not an uncommon thing, but at some point you have to have milestones and payoffs in your technology to make that viable.
The reason that you go live should not be, oh God, we need money. It should be, this is ready to go.
Right.
And that was not the reason that they went live. They had a very large contract with Safeway, which never came to fruition because of all the problems with Walgreens. And then there was the contract with Walgreens, and it was falling apart very quickly. There are practical issues with taking blood. You know, what happens if someone is resistant? What happens if someone's anxious? What happens if someone faints? There is someone in the documentary that I talked about who goes through that whole thing. None of the people at Walgreens really were trained at how to take blood. And especially when it became not a finger prick situation, it became a venous situation for most of these.
I don't know many, honestly. I don't know many pharmacies that employ phlebotomists. They just don't.
No, they just don't. So here's the second one. This gets into the whole finger prick, testing, and so
can we see
under
that
pressure? What's that?
Can you see that picture?
Yeah, that was kind of her. This is almost a logo. This is what she did, and there's a lot of these.
This is a signature photo, really.
Yeah. Now there are actually different poses of her doing this. So, this is when shit started hitting the fan. So we have the regulatory commissions basically telling her, the FDA inspectors telling her that she can only do one test. They're approving one test. It was like some herpes test that very rarely happens on her machines using the finger prick method.
Right.
And, none of the others.
If you watch the video, and I recommend it. There are a couple of documentaries. I recommend the HBO. But if you watch the video, the ginormous celebration that they have for that one approval is absurd. It's, again, misleading for the employees, actually.
Right.
It's to keep them excited in something that's essentially falling apart, and pretty soon they're not going to have a fucking job, essentially, is what
it was considered a huge victory that they got FDA approval, when in all actuality, they got FDA approval for one test out of 200 or whatever it was. And they were cracking down.
In actuality, what they told her was she needed to stop what she was doing because they were only going to approve one thing. It wasn't, oh, this is a great technology, and you've usurped the bounds of all kinds of,
right,
technological advances. It wasn't that at all, even though they.
So here's the one thing I really want to bring up. During the inspection, FDA officials indicated to Theranos that the agency considers the nanotainers made and used by the company to collect finger prick blood an unapproved medical device. So that means they have to get it approved.
Right.
Which means more testing, which means it's going to fall apart, and it did. One thing that I did want,
proving that it works. I mean, again, everything you do when it comes to anything invasive, anything you do when it comes to manufacturing a product that's going to be used to draw blood from somebody, to result in medical tests, anything that you approve, anything that's used in that process has to be approved by the FDA. It's just the way it works. As I said before, I work for a company that made filters that are used for inline, the inline dispensing of drugs. And if we
Right.
change one thing about that filter, literally, the FDA had to come into our facility and approve it before we could then turn around and provide it to the pharmaceutical company that was waiting for it. So,
Right. Now, one thing that I want to say is that to elevate this from like the investigative part to the exposure part, you need people inside the company. You need whistleblowers, and the two that John Carreyrou actually says that there were 4 primary whistleblowers, but there were 2 they were prominent and eventually became the face of this: Erica Chung and Tyler Schultz. Tyler Schultz happened to be George Schultz's grandson. And George Schultz introduced him to Elizabeth Holmes. And initially, Tyler Schultz was really taken by her and said, "Hey, do you guys take interns?" He worked for them, and then quickly realized what this was and began trying to whistleblow on his own. He actually went to his grandfather, who stonewalled him. But during this whole thing, he was terrified. He was a whistleblower. He was a whistleblower that John Carreyrou initially reached out to, and Tyler Schultz was terrified, and he asked to be anonymous. Now, the one thing is that he had emailed to someone in the company. I don't know if it was Sonny Balwani, who, by the way, was the boyfriend of Elizabeth Holmes, and became kind of the face of the company when Elizabeth wasn't around. And he was known as a tyrant and fired everybody. He was kind of the bully outside of the legal counsel and the security. They beefed up security. As this went along, you saw more security around Elizabeth Holmes to keep her insulated. But so as this went along, Tyler Schultz revealed to John Carreyrou a number like 49% or something like that. He revealed a number that basically outed him. So his parents told him, "Hey, they know." And eventually he talked to his grandfather, and lawyers came to the grandfather. He basically got ambushed, as did Erica Chung. But at some point, months before this article came out, John Carreyrou had reached out, asked to talk to Elizabeth Holmes. She'd been stonewalled at every turn. And then sometime in June, there was a meeting that was agreed upon, and he met with 4 lawyers and 3 other people. Elizabeth Holmes wasn't there, including David Boyce, who was the prominent lawyer. He was a guy who had been involved in very high-powered cases prior. The Al Gore 2016 comes to mind. Later on, he defended Harvey Weinstein. He went after Microsoft. He was known for a 20-hour deposition of Bill Gates. I mean, he was considered a very tough guy. What blows me away in this article is that Boyce admits that Theranos does not do all of their testing on their machine. They didn't say how many, but he actually admitted that they essentially use third-party machines. They didn't say which ones or anything like that, but in a way, he outed his own client.
As it turns out, they use Siemens quite a bit, and Siemens were the people they were trying to put out of business.
They were trying to put out of business. One of the things that the competitors, which was LabCorp and Quest, were saying is that they weren't doing peer-reviewed. They didn't do any peer review at all on their equipment. And what they were saying was weird. It was like, well, we use a lot of the chemical analysis that those other companies do. So why would we do that? It wasn't really about the chemical process in their, in their description, which actually wasn't true either, because they diluted the samples to try to make them bigger so that it became a thing. But what they were saying is it's the mechanical part of it, it's the engineering part, which again wasn't true. So because they were using the major lab companies' machines. And what David Boyce essentially was saying is, hey, this is a process. We're moving towards, using more and more of the, of the proprietary machines, which opened up a whole new can of worms. Right. Anyway, David Boyce would eventually leave the company. There was another high part of a King. What was her first name? She was on, I believe she was Hillary Clinton's counsel. She was also there during that meeting. Do you remember her? Yeah. So
I can't remember her name myself, but
yeah, but. So this is a whole mess. I do want to say that John Carreyrou is basically the star of the exposure part of this whole story. And the Wall Street Journal, if you want to know the guts of it, you go to the Wall Street Journal. They're kind of the place to go for the Theranos saga. Kind of like the Boston Globe was with with the Spotlight team with the pedophile priests, or the Wall Street Journal is known for this story now.
Right. And
John Carreyrou is the reason. Right. He started this journey, and there were a couple things that he did. He did his research. He read the Canaletta piece. He was tenacious about it. He did story after story after story using research over 3 years. And a big part of it is that he was able to listen and get confidence of insiders in the company, which is essential to this whole thing. Now, when we as consumers or outsiders or non-journalists look at information, especially now in the age of what we're doing now, what does a normal person do? I think that they are not really even in the investigative stage. They're kind of in the hero worship stage. They're in the, look at all of the people that are involved. This is like really cool. And, just the marketing part of it, whether it be, we've done a lot of stories on this whole thing, on how people get smitten by somebody because of their contacts, like Jeffrey Epstein, or you have The Intercept. Oh, look at all the people on their team, or whoever it is.
Right. Yep.
This woman, Elizabeth Holmes, was the face of this company, and she was smoke and mirrors. She was all sales pitch. And once it got into the nuts and bolts of it, she fell apart.
Yeah.
At one point, when the FDA started coming in and the test started to fail, she had the nerve to say that she blamed her lab techs and that she had no idea.
They didn't tell her.
She is the face of this company.
That was patently not true.
Right.
There were lab techs that raised their hands several times. You will see that in the documentary. And we're told by, I believe, Sonny Balwani, that, well, maybe if you don't believe in this company, you should be working somewhere else.
Right. That was a typical line. That was a typical line. Or when people would question the size of the machine, because that was a big thing. That was a big sales pitch. She equated that to draining people's blood, and she had a big fear of needles, and there was just part of her mythos, actually.
Right.
And she wanted that there was a dream of hers to have these portable machines in every home, as well as in Walgreens everywhere, so everybody had access to her tech, which didn't work, which wasn't practical. And people continued to tell her that over and over and over again. And she said, well, maybe you're not part of Silicon Valley. Maybe you should leave. Maybe you should go, blah, 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 blah. So this is a history of the Wall Street investigations. By the way, before was a history of John Carreyrou's stories, which got his foot in the door with Tyler Schultz, because Tyler Schultz saw that he had gotten results in the past. As I said, there was a Medicare fraud story, and he had done other stories involving medical companies before. So you would have to go back a few, actually probably like 5 or 6 pages, but let me see here. All right, that's fun. Anyway, you would have to go back a while, but he had done, this is a story on Tyler Schultz. Eventually, they had to just shut their labs down. Theranos dissolved in 2018.
Right. At one point, when the other thing that the FDA had to do was inspect their labs. That's another thing that becomes
right.
When you're dealing with this kind of stuff, especially blood. I mean, nothing. What could be more invasive than taking someone's blood, all right, for examination. So they had to, inspect the labs. Our manufacturing facilities had to be inspected by the FDA. And when they send these people in, by the way, they are sending people in that know what they're looking for. But she literally, if you watch the HBO documentary, her lab was a shambles. They literally built a lab in the basement just to accommodate the FDA to come in and do an inspection. It wasn't even their real lab, but the FDA didn't know that. It's just amazing, when I hear, benevolent corruption or whatever the fuck it is. This is not what this girl was about. Okay?
Right.
This is not what this girl was about. Okay.
Noble cause corruption.
Corruption. I'm sorry, benevolent corruption, whatever the fuck it is. I don't care what kind of corruption you call it. Guess what? Corruption is corruption.
Right.
And it can't be noble cause if you're not producing anything that actually does anything for anyone.
So
actually harm people.
Right. So his last story before Theranos was in June of 2015. This is about right. It was a health diagnostic lab, and we're talking about kickback laws and stuff like that. So Medicare fraud. So he was familiar with long-term stories and getting results.
It should be mentioned here also that Tyler Schultz, and I don't know, Dave, you may be mentioning this later, but this is part of the documentary as well. Although his grandfather was George Schultz, the former Secretary of State, it took his grandfather a while to come around to believing in his grandson, because he was so absolutely dead set that she would never lie, George Schultz. But the fact of the matter is that it literally forced what happened with Tyler Schultz literally forced his family to have to sell their home because the attorney fees to deal with David Boyes and the rest of the attorneys from Theranos cost them over $500,000.
Right. And that story on Tyler Schultz is in here again. If you're interested, I think you might have to. You probably have a couple of free articles to begin with. You might have to do an introductory subscription to the Wall Street Journal, but for this, it's worth it.
Or you can do what we do: use more than one browser. Because if you open the story up on a separate browser, if you reach a limit on one brauser, open it up on another browser and you can read it. I do it all day long, so I know it works. Every publication will give you 5 free articles or 6 free articles. And you just go to a different browser and open it up and go to the page.
Right. But this is worth it. This is worth.
By the way.
Yeah, I have 3. So, but they do talk about that. I don't think the parents actually ever had to sell the home because once the story broke, it was over, and they had another focus. Then now they had to put out the fire of the story instead of stopping them from publishing the story.
Right.
But eventually, Tyler Schultz's grandfather did come around and say, "Hey, I had no idea at the level of lies that she was telling. I'm so sorry, and I'm proud of you." So whatever you think of George Schultz or any of these people who were investors or part of the board,
I can't think of what I like, but I don't think any of them deserve to be defrauded. So
defrauded or have family turmoil like that. They actually had lawyers come into George Schultz's home and verbally berate his grandson. And at one point, George Schultz said, "Hey, my wife almost took an iron to one of them." It's
funny because in the documentary, Tyler Schultz says that his grandfather was acting like the Secretary of State because he'd bring the attorneys in from Theranos and put them in one room, and then he'd go back to the other room and talk to the attorneys for his grandson. So some of the stuff was pretty cute. He's pretty and he's pretty credible. I think Tyler Schultz. I was impressed by
and the same thing with Erica Chung. Actually, both of them were credible. And when you see it again, we put a couple of videos in there, almost comparing them to Elizabeth Holmes. And the ironic part of it is that the workers were way more credible than the actual founder of the company. One of the things
the workers were the ones who actually cared about the potential harm of patients, no matter what anyone tells you about, whatever that kind of corruption is that we were talking about. I just think it's
noble cause.
I just think noble cause corruption is an oxymoron. It's like,
once you go live and you do, and I'll get into it at the end. Once you go live and once you stop worrying about the patients and worrying more about covering your ass and getting donations and getting more money to keep this thing going, that's out the window.
Right.
So, after the funny thing is that after the story broke, she met with this gentleman, or she was interviewed by this gentleman, the global technology editor of the Wall Street Journal, and his demeanor, to me, is fascinating because he pretty much knows that he has her, and he's very laid back, and but he does ask the questions about proprietary machines and her methods and all of that, and she just is steadfast. He asked her point blank, do you regret going live as quickly as you did? And she said, we're the same company as we were. Some guy writing a couple of articles isn't going to change who we are. We're doing the right thing, blah, 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 blah. And I know that John Carreyrou was watching this and just said that her lying on his home turf was amazing. There were a couple of things to this.
Flat out fucking lying about something.
Right.
He's flat out, flying in the face of everything that he uncovered. And he's really kind of funny it's kind of funny in the documentary when he looks at the camera and he said, she's lying. I can't believe she's lying.
Right. And Roger Parloff of Fortune magazine, the guy who was smitten by the whole board, which, by the way, is one of the things, whether it was conscious or unconscious, it probably was conscious. I've seen it before. I saw it with Epstein and a couple other people. You get these very high-powered people around you to build credibility. And we will get to the board in just a moment. But over time, that board actually became a liability, or people question it. So you build just this mythos. Again, everybody was just fascinated by the people on this board. You had ex-heads of state. You had, George Shultz and Henry Kissinger and all these guys. And then eventually somebody's like, wait a minute, there's very few medical people on this board.
No medical people on this board.
Right. One thing I wanted to mention is that right after these stories broke, which were explosive and damning and basically began the downfall, eventually the FDA was going to come after Theranos and test them and do all of that. And the CMS, which was a committee or the Council of Medicaid and Medicare Services, which, by the way, they started this ball rolling. And by the way, Erica Chung, who was another person who was hounded by David Boyce and his legal team, she went to a lawyer who told her to whistleblow, and she did by writing the CMS.
Right.
This Medicare and Medicaid Services organization, and they were the ones that really started to put the pressure on and start the testing going. And after that, it quickly fell apart. I mean, the other thing that really was their undoing were the blood tests that were coming back from Walgreens. People notice. You only had what was it? I always mix it up. So it was which state was it? Arizona. It was Arizona. So there was Arizona, which is the state that she lobbied for that law to be passed, which it was passed, and that's a potential situation in the future. There was Arizona, there was Northern California, and I think there was one lab in Pennsylvania. And eventually 1 million blood tests were rescinded.
1 million.
1 million. Imagine what would have happened if it would have gone national.
Right.
So here are a couple of things I wanted to show you from Lydia Ramsey Flanzer. She's with Business Insider. Once this broke, there were other reporters, obviously, that were going to piggyback on this story. This is what happens. So she's pretty good. She talks about startups and things of that nature. So if you have an interest in startups, I would look at her columns. She talks about the fact that there are very few medical people on this board. So let's look at the board really, really quickly.
They're telling you how many blood tests, 240. They were promoting 240, not just 200. 240, they got approval for one.
They went, as far as talking about going up to 1,000,
Right.
Yeah. So the members: former Secretary of State George Shultz, retired U.S. Navy Admiral Gary Roughead, former U.S. Secretary of Defense William Perry. And by the way, I think this is building this whole mythos again that they had military contracts. I think that's where they were going with this.
Right.
Sam Nunn, former chairman of the Senate Armed Service Committee's permanent subcommittee on investigations, which I think is funny. Mad Dog Mattis, James Mattis.
If I had seen him on the board, I never would have given them a penny if I had the money to give. As soon as I saw Mad Dog Mattis, I said, "Oh, Jesus."
The word that Mad Dog Mattis used when describing Elizabeth Holmes: integrity.
Well, you know what? I'm sorry.
That's Mad Dog Mattis.
That's his idea of integrity, but that doesn't surprise me.
Richard Kvezovich, that's a former CEO of Wells Fargo. Henry Kissinger, Bill Frist, heart and lung transplant.
There's two medical guys on this board.
Yeah, and the former director of the CDC, William Fogg. Riley Bechtel Group, and then you had Sonny Balwani and Elizabeth Holmes.
Do we remember what Sonny Balwani's background was?
I don't. I know he had a business background. I don't know if he had a medical background. I don't think so.
No, he doesn't have a medical background. I'm just curious. I'm now I want to know. So you go ahead and keep talking.
Okay.
I just want to see.
Now, I wanted to mention Phyllis Gardner and kind of highlight her, as well as Tyler Schultz and Erica Chung, who came forward. And by the way, were put under tremendous stress on that whole thing. Erica Chung, who was not privileged whatsoever. Tyler Schultz actually came from a rich background, obviously. But Erica Chung didn't. She at one point lived in a rough neighborhood. She was mugged. She was sexually assaulted a couple of times. So this whole thing really freaked her out. When she sees a guy in her employment, which at this point she wasn't at Theranos anymore. She went to another job. She had somebody just basically stalking her. She's freaked out, and there was a lawyer or a server or whatever for Theranos shoving a David Boyce, a lawyer, thing in her hand. But you had someone from the very beginning, she knew Elizabeth Holmes was full of crap, and that is Dr. Phyllis Gardner.
By the way, his background, just so you know.
Yeah.
Software.
Okay.
He worked for Commerce One. He was a, computer sciences guy. No medical background, no science background in anything. And by the way, he was 37 and she was 18 when they met.
Okay.
So, and she met him in high school in her senior year.
Okay. Well, part of this whole thing too was kind of how they kept their relationship secret, and she was secretly living with him for a really long time, and blah blah blah. Personally, that wasn't it. Both of them at this point are being charged with securities fraud. So, and fraud.
Separate. I think I don't know when it's.
They are.
But it's separate.
It's separate. She actually, at some point or in some way, she cooperated. He didn't at all. So it's going to be a different thing. But it's going to be interesting to see. I know I believe they're in jury deliberations now. What I will say is that I think so, but they might still be. Are they still in the trial itself? I thought she was
still
testifying.
I think her testimony is scheduled to go through tomorrow.
Okay. Well, that'll be fun.
But you should see. You should read that. Gardner, wants her convicted.
Right. And this is where Dr. Phyllis Gardner, a Stanford Medical School professor, was skeptical of the Theranos founder, Elizabeth Holmes, early on, having rejected Holmes's ideas for a patch that could deploy antibiotics. So she raised her concerns with reporters, including the Wall Street Journal's John Carreyrou, who quoted her in the article questioning how well the company's blood testing technology worked. Now, I didn't go through all of that, as well as Ian Gibbons, who was a scientist who actually had patents with Elizabeth Holmes. Elizabeth Holmes does not own any of her patents anymore. She sold them off, I guess. But I'll mention this real quickly. Some of those patents involve, you guessed it, COVID testing. So I think that people should really look long and hard at any of those to make sure that stuff works. For Gardner, this story isn't over. I just want her convicted. All I want to see is her in an orange jumpsuit with a black turtleneck accent. She basically says that, look, this woman, she does not represent all women in science. Just because I'm not going to defend somebody just because of their gender. And you go further into this, that basically there were a couple of things. This whole idea of try till you succeed or fake it till you make it is completely ridiculous in terms of healthcare, because you're putting patients at risk. Okay. When you have people's lives at risk, you don't do that. And she would basically tell everybody that she could possibly tell that she didn't trust Elizabeth Holmes. Funny thing is that the day after, or like right when this whole story broke, two things happened. And I have all of this in the, in the sources. And this is described in the documentary as well. She gets a Harvard Board of Fellowship that day, or the day of, or whatever, right after the story breaks, and she goes on Jim Cramer Mad Money. A few years later, Jim Cramer actually interviews John Carreyrou and completely changes his mind, like so many others over time. Phyllis Gardner never changed her mind, always tried to steer people away from this girl. There were a lot of Stanford students who were lured to Theranos. She would advise them not to go there. She would tell her colleagues that she didn't trust Elizabeth Holmes, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. By 2014, Holmes was being featured on covers of business magazines and included on lists of top executives. Gardner wasn't pleased. I was just barfing all over the place, Gardner said. I really like her, actually. I support women. I always have. I've gotten in trouble for it. I push hard, but I'm not going to support a fraud. I don't care what your gender is. So, and let me see if I can find, I can't find the Oh, there we go. This is basically it. Her rationale for her dislike is simple. You put people in danger. I don't forgive that.
She's a doctor. So
she is a doctor. She has been on boards and has created her own startups a couple of times. So she is very experienced in this. Part of the process of all this, Roger Parloff actually said he wasn't experienced in some of the process, so he kind of dropped the ball. He didn't go to any colleagues maybe but she knew from firsthand knowledge, she from the 80s.
Right.
She's been dealing with this for a very long time. So,
by the way, that article right there,
yeah,
right underneath the one you just showed,
yeah,
there's a link to it. I believe it's Carreyrou that says, this is when he knew he had a story. There's a link
right
at the bottom. I would look at that. I looked at that last night. So,
which one here? Oh, this? No. Oh, the thing with
it's at the
100 hours.
Yeah, it's at the bottom of the article, but it's the first.
Right. This one right here. No, I don't know.
I'll show you. It's at the bottom of this article.
Okay.
There's 3 links underneath it. One is a story on DeVos. There's a second story, but the top story is how the man who broke the story knew when he had it.
Right.
So that's a good story too.
And the bottom line is, through all the hype and all of what was going on, Phyllis Gardner was always there.
Right.
And I guess you had to go through this process of processing the information. We went through that with the Medical Freedom Super PAC and Kennedy, or Robert F. Kennedy, and all of that. At first you're like, oh yeah, Kennedy, and then you do your research, and
yep.
So
then you
basically,
understand that even though he calls it the Children's Defense Fund, he really doesn't give a shit about children.
Right.
That's the reality of it. These people know how to play you. They know.
And one reality too is that in order for startups to start up, they need to raise money. So they do need to hype their product
right
to some point. Tyler Schultz, in the video that I'm going to reference, he talks about that. He says that at one point he said that he projected $1 million revenue or whatever he said. So what happens is investors cut that number in half, thinking that you doubled it.
Right.
To begin with. He didn't know the game. He was telling the truth. And they're like, no, we're not interested because, blah, blah, blah. So, and people expect startups to conflate.
Right.
But when you had Elizabeth Holmes, and by the way, I didn't even go into some of the investors, Betsy DeVos, we had venture capitalists, Larry Ellison from Oracle. We had all these guys come out. And by the way, ironically enough, Rupert Murdoch, who owns Wall Street Journal, which, by the way, that wasn't the catalyst for the story. It just happened to be. Now, the bottom line is that, as Dr. Gardner said, this woman put people's lives at risk. Now, it's going to be interesting to see what Ramesh Sunny Balwani, and what Elizabeth Holmes gets as a punishment. She's pretty much disgraced as a businesswoman, but you think somebody's not going to pick her up?
She's blaming him, just so you know.
Yeah, she is.
She's blaming him.
She's blaming him. She's blaming the lab technicians. And I guess
he's abused.
Right.
And honestly, they're out there.
Right.
What I just saw the article here. Her texts with Sunny Balwani were made public, and
They're bad.
yeah, I mean, it's not just, it's not just the stuff they talk about. It's the, the lovey-dovey part that's in there too. I mean, everything because they had access to all of her texts. So,
Right. Well, I'll end with this. After she blamed her lab technicians, we had Dr. Phyllis Gardner basically say, "Listen, Elizabeth Holmes, you're the head of this," and said that her husband's favorite phrase, Phyllis's husband's favorite phrase was, "Excuses are like assholes. Everyone has one."
yeah.
That you have to own up to your mistakes.
And that's the one. That's the line she said they didn't have to include in the article in the
right. She said you don't have to
but
put
they
that
included it. It was funny.
Yeah. Alex Gibney was laughing his ass off in the background, but she just was like, whatever. But the bottom line is, there are people out there who are going to use marketing, cult of personality to stretch the truth to extreme lengths. They may not be the norm, but they're out there, and you have to do your due diligence. When someone tells you to use borax to
take your vaccines out of your body,
you might want to question it.
There's a new one now, bloodletting.
Right.
You can vaccinate yourself by bloodletting. There's all kinds of stuff. I'm telling you, people, you know what? You are never going to see any links to the last American vagabond in anything we do or anybody like that. Unless
we're doing an expose on them.
We just don't use those sources. Are not journalistic sources. They're not credible. Okay. They have.
And by the way, I'll say this again. When people say all we do is plop stories down, I actually vetted this. I actually trimmed it down. There's a lot of stuff from John Carreyrou, a lot of videos out there. There is a ton of stuff now on Theranos if you really want to do it. But I try to get the cream of the crop stuff, and the stuff that you really have to. It's kind of a primer for you, because there's so much out there.
I'm going to go one step further with what you said. We're doing this because we know you're not.
Right.
And I'm sorry, but. Some guy, I did that 3-hour video on the January 6th insurrection because I know there's a ton of research out there that's already been done, but I know it's been released in fits and starts and in spurts, and people don't go back and look for stuff. I do, but that's me. And someone said, well, you're not doing any research. Well, I don't have to do any research. This stuff is out there. What I'm trying to do is show you why January 6th shouldn't be ignored or forgotten. Okay. Right. My whole point here is I don't have to go out and research anymore. These idiots who stormed the Capitol put themselves on video and gave everybody this evidence. Okay. So, all I'm trying to do is explain to you, this is part of when you want to read something, especially someone who's giving you medical advice, get in a bathtub with all of these herbs and then dump a cup of Boraxo in there. Does anybody know what Boraxo is? I mean, fucking seriously, you really need to think about this shit, okay?
Right.
And you need to look this stuff up. I know it's not a popular thing. It takes a lot of time. And so you know what? So we're doing it.
We're trying. I mean, again, I'll go back to what I said before. There's the promotion stage, and this from curiosity to infatuation. There is the investigation stage, which, by the way, part of it is reading.
Right.
We're not reporters. We don't go out and interview Elizabeth Holmes or, all of these guys. I mean, if somebody, we don't have to. It's here. It's here. They've done the work for you. And part of it is you question who is criticizing these guys and who's trying to discredit these news organizations.
Right.
This is incredibly difficult work. You have to go to people who don't want to talk, either people who are terrified to talk or people who have something to hide.
Right.
And then you have the exposure part, which, it's fun, I'm sure, for these guys to showcase their work, but it's work. It's a ton of work.
Right.
To go after this. I'm sure it's not fun to have a bunch of lawyers come into your newsroom and slam recorders on your table,
right,
which is what David Boyce and his lawyers did. But what do you do as an investigator? What did John Carreyrou do? He slammed his recorder on his table.
Let me also just say this. They go in and they're looking to expose something, okay? And this was the point I was making about little Mr. Hissy Fit, Glenn Greenwald, not liking editors looking at his work, which is the only reason he fucking left The Intercept. I'm sorry.
Right.
You know what? Not every story that you want to do gets approved by your editorial board. That's why they have editors there. So, when you were, again, I'm going to use All the President's Men. I'm going to use, Woodward and Bernstein when they broke Watergate. When they brought this information in, this is what this guy said to them. Okay, you got this from this one guy. You're going to need 2 more sources to corroborate what he's saying. This is how actual real publications work. This is how let me just say this, whether you want to hear it or not, this is how the fucking mainstream media works. Okay. Right. Every mainstream media outlet has an editorial board that will vote up or vote down what you're doing based on whether or not they can defend it. Because there could be a time when you are questioned or end up in court, and you have to be able to provide corroboration. That's the rule of journalism. Right.
And by the way, evidence. Richard Parloff was given.
Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry.
Richard Parloff was given documents upon documents upon documents. He said, "Oh, okay, yeah, that was another mistake they made. They didn't go over the documents. They didn't pore over them. You didn't look at the data. You just there is a process to this, and even we fall into it." Deb followed Glenn Greenwald, and we followed Chris Hedges, and we follow all of these guys. And at one point, you kind of get into not a hero worship part, but you admire them to some degree. And then you go, wait a minute, why'd they do that? Where are they going? What are they doing? And that's the investigation part.
Right. By the way, let me just say this. This is my favorite. This is a magnet that I keep. I had this when I worked at Millipore.
Yeah.
You can tell it's kind of fading, but it's a magnet, and it basically says we have charts and graphs to back us up, so fuck off. That's like one of my favorite magnets. It's right there on my desk. It's right there attached to my desk. So
and by the way, the article, the first article that John Carreyrou posted has plenty of charts and graphs for you guys who like visuals too. It talks about the just the variation of the different blood tests that Theranos were giving. One day you would be fine, and the next day you'd have to go to the emergency room, and then the next day you should go to your doctor, and then the next day you're fine. So basically it affected people. As I said, there are 2 parts to this. Investors were duped out of hundreds of millions of dollars, but more importantly, patients were adversely affected.
Right.
So, and that's why you have regulatory boards. That's why you have the CDC. That's why you have the FDA. And when you are given the power to do your own labs without knowing what the hell you're doing, that's very dangerous.
Well, because you know what, again, I'm going to liken it to what I did last night in the video. you have doctors, okay? And
Yeah.
you know, like, so you have bad doctors, you have good doctors. You know, wherever people are involved in anything, you have the potential for good and bad. It's part of life, right? You have
Right.
good electricians and you have bad electricians. So if you get a bad electrician, you're going to turn around and fucking wire your own home? I don't think so. You know what? You go
Right.
out, if you're not happy, you go out and you find somebody that you can work with. This is all of life, no matter how you want to look at it. But,
Right.
you know, I don't like Betsy DeVos, and I don't like most of the people on her board. I don't like
Right.
most of the people
Right.
that invested in her money, invested money in her company. But neither do I
Elizabeth
think
Holmes
she
and
should get away
Theranos,
with
yeah.
it. Neither do I think she should get away with it just because it's Betsy DeVos and I can't stand her. No, you know what? She needs to be held accountable for this.
Right. There are there are a lot of billionaires and like high-powered guys that did this. And by the way, guys, the reality is that's probably how Elizabeth Holmes is going to be punished, or why she's going to be punished for securities fraud. All of these things that she did with the investors. This is probably how she's going to get.
I mean, they basically, you know, her company was valued at $9 billion. She was valued at $4 billion. Basically took everything from her so that they could pay back some of the investors. They haven't really all been paid back yet, and they haven't all been paid back their total amount. So,
you know, Rupert Murdoch hadn't been paid back yet. I know that Betsy DeVos hasn't been paid back yet. A lot of them are still trying to sue for
$100 million.
$100.
The DeVos family, $100 million.
Yeah.
That's a lot of money to give somebody, to have them, you know, shiesty you basically.
Once you have a powerful board like that, and you look at it, and you look at the sales pitch, and everything is out there, and you don't really go into it any further, you go, wow, this could really revolutionize blah, 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 until the John Carreyrou article comes out or whatever. You don't know. Now, there were always questions, but they were kind of in the background.
Right.
So I wanted to mention one thing that happened, and I know what time it is.
I know what time. I'm good.
Recently, I got a notification on my phone. It said Citibank, there is fraudulent activity on your card or whatever. I forgot I even had a card from Citibank, but it has a zero balance, and I checked it. So there was a notification that I had to go to this website and blah, blah, blah. I immediately, what do? I Google Citibank fraud. Caution, there's a phishing scam going on. Do not click on this, blah, 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 blah. How many people would actually click on that damn thing? More than you would think. So this isn't just Theranos, it's life. And when I go on the cesspool, which is Facebook, you know, here's another one. Okay, which is more practical at this point. So you have our governor, Kathy Hochul, tweeted earlier today, there are cases in Ontario from Omicron. Please, guys, get vaccinated, please, guys. And they're like, oh, that's a scam. Oh, are you invested? Are you invested in pharmaceutical companies? But you know where I'm coming from.
Yeah, I do.
What was my question? Are there travel restrictions, you know, potentially in place between Ontario or Canada and New York? What would happen? I mean, so we had the Facebook idiots, or the Twitiots. This was Twitter, actually. So the Twitiots saying, you know, jumping to conclusions. So that's the infatuation stage, or the promotion stage of their side of it. And then I asked an investigation question. Like, you know, okay, what's going on? What's being done? Is there anything being done? So I'm still getting positive feedback on that question. I haven't gotten an answer yet, but we'll see. I'm curious to know. I want to know about the practical applications. I've already gotten vaccinated. I want to know about what they're doing in our state to keep this from spreading. I don't care. No.
Anthony Fauci's already said it gets here eventually.
It will get here eventually. It will get here eventually, but
they're already working on it. They're already working on, understanding what it is so that they can, switch the vaccines or boost the vaccines if they need to do it. And this is going to go on for a long time, because as I've said, these things are coming out on a worldwide basis, all these variants and all these mutations. They're coming out of countries where the vaccine level is low because they're poor countries. South Africa is one of those countries, and the African countries are one of those countries. And this is something until it's not just getting vaccinated here, it's vaccinating the world when it's a pandemic. That's what really has to happen. Whether you people like it or not, tough shit. It's the way the world goes. It's the way illness is spread from one country to another. And by the way, I'm just going to say this. Today in Boston, they allowed a plane to land from South Africa on a stopover on its way to somewhere else. So, let me just give you a little update. She is being cross-examined today. This is her
okay. I thought it was over. Okay.
This is her fourth day of testimony. So
Jesus. She
testified for 2 days last week in her defense with her attorneys. So now the real danger for her as the perpetrator testifying at her own trial comes with the cross-examination, because they're going to go after details. Okay. They're going to question her on details. She faces 11 counts of fraud for allegedly lying to investors and patients about her company's capabilities.
Yep.
Each count carries
20 years, right?
20 years in prison.
Yep.
So, by the way, there is another documentary here listed, just so you know. Yahoo Finance documentary, Valley of Hype, the culture that built Elizabeth Holmes. I believe it's on her and Silicon Valley itself.
If you want to add that, I have. It's, in my opinion, it's not as good because it actually paints her as a victim in some respects. And she's not. It's like, oh well, I think she got caught up, blah blah blah. Listen,
I don't think she got caught up.
She created harm.
Deliberately lying. No, when you start deliberately lying and you're building a fucking lab to mislead the FDA, all of that goes out the window. All of that goes out the window. So.
It's just this whole sympathetic thing towards her. She created harm. That's it.
By the way, she created her own mess. So, and by the way, when she dropped out of Stanford to start this company at 19 years old, she had taken two chemical engineering courses. That was it. And dropped out. And by the way, as a freshman, you're usually not allowed to take chemical engineering. But again, her sweet talking ways made Stanford University succumb to her charm. I'm going to talk to you a little bit before you start watching the videos about her.
Right.
A lot of people find her captivating. I find her fucking creepy. Her imitation of Steve Jobs goes all the way down to lowering her voice. If you see in this part of this where she talks in her real voice, her on-screen voice is not her real voice. She's a sham from start to finish.
She uses
turtlenecks, the same thing Steve Jobs used to do. The headset on, the rah-rah, walking around talking to her employees, dancing through dancing through the company to "You Can't Touch This" by MC Hammer. When she got approved for one test that is run maybe once every 6 months. You know what? It's all.
By the way, that was a major blow again, and they used it. By the way, there was this entire mythos about her uncle, and her uncle was her life, and he died, and she wanted to, so that nobody would have to go through that again. Well, if she wanted to do that, then why put people in harm's way? She didn't want people to have to deal with needles. She had a big fear of needles. If she wanted to do that, why did she go live and to the point where they had to use venous testing?
I just have
Come
to
on.
My kid hates needles.
Right.
But I just have to tell you this. Once you got to gander it, once you got to gander at the virus, she had no problem going to get needles. No,
right.
None whatsoever.
You kind of get over it.
Yeah. But
there's a lot more. There's a lot more to this, but I mean, and her again, everybody questions whether she meant to or not. Doesn't matter. She used Stanford. There's a big mythos behind Stanford. You had guys like Zuckerberg and all these guys who left. She got some investors simply from that.
right.
Bitcoin guy, or the guy who was like, he invested first in a lot of stuff. A Draper, I think was his name.
Yeah.
His daughter was a family friend. She, by the way, again, she was from money. I don't know how many people she'd be able to just ingratiate herself. She ingratiated herself with George Shultz. She became basically a surrogate daughter. She went to his house. She went to Christmas, to like Christmas stuff with them. I mean, that's not normal.
That's not normal for, you may go to dinner with them, but they don't become part of your family.
Right.
It's again, the tall, blonde, young chicken ingratiating herself with rich, white, middle-aged men.
Right.
It's essentially what she did.
The board, she created this board just as, to like be impressive. She got this contract to be impressive, and she impressed people.
Yep.
So she got investors. Now it's time to put up.
She
couldn't put up.
That Walgreens could actually use. They gave her $150 million.
Right.
They literally redid the insides of their buildings to put her logo up. It was a big thing. And, they took a hosing on that.
There was an expert phlebotomist, and you'll see her in the, I believe her name was Serena Stewart. I hope that's right. I'm not sure. If I got it wrong, I'm sorry. But Miss Phlebotomist, she trained these people. She trained people, in the practicality of it. She took the tests from Theranos, and she said that, at one point she geared up her resume, number one, and she started laughing about it. And then she said, look, I had to retake all these tests. It's bad when you are working for a company and you don't believe in the work that they're doing. Eventually, most of these people left.
Said, now I see what's going on. It's time to.
She's laughing about it.
Yeah.
Now, Ian Gibbons, who I mentioned before, he committed suicide.
I know. It's
because
amazing.
he was trying to get people to listen, and they wouldn't listen. Yep. So, and his wife was just asked for the documentation back. They treated her like dirt. And then there was, I believe it was the lawyer King. She basically said, well, he wasn't coming to work late. Like it's his fault.
Yeah, I know.
He was mentally unstable or whatever.
Yeah, it's certainly it's fault that the company couldn't run the test.
Right.
Anyway, we're good.
I think we've done it.
We got it. We got everything. There's going to be a lot of stuff in here. Again, I know you really need to start reading, people. I don't know what to tell you. I'm sorry that we can't put this in a meme. I know how that works for people. You think that as soon as they come by your desk, they have to be true because it's all over Facebook. But look, there's so much bullshit out there that if you don't vet information, you could be in real trouble. Anybody who's thinking of taking a bath in Baraxo. We got a new one now. We have a child who was rushed to the hospital because they were listening to somebody who believes in using some kind of bleach to devaccinate, but this woman gave it to her child because she had a cough. because the woman said it worked. This shit, people need to understand something. Drinking bleach.
Right. The bleach is a big thing. Ivermectin, hydroxychloroquine, all this stuff. Do your research. By the way, it's one thing to talk about an iPhone or a remote control that you can fake it until you make it.
Right.
When you're talking about somebody's health, that's a completely different story. That's another theme in this whole thing. Right. So it's up to you to do your own research and make your own decisions. I would implore anybody in Arizona to call for that law to be repealed. I looked, and to my knowledge, that law has not been repealed. I know that some states allow people to call for their own labs. That's insane.
Usually what happens is, like with my daughter, Dahlia, she's on some medication. She has to have her levels checked, right? Here's what happens. You go to the lab, but the doctor gives you the slip that tells you what you need. End of story. You don't make that decision yourself. To turn that over to I understand, one of the other themes that ran through all of her shit was people have control over their own healthcare that way. Well, that's what they said about giving pharmaceutical companies the right to advertise direct to customers. All these ads you see for hypertension stuff, heart medications, all of the stuff you see on TV. You know what? I remember a time when none of that was on television. That was not allowed under the law. Pharmaceutical companies can only go to doctors. Okay. Now they can advertise to the public. So you have people going in and asking for pills for things they don't even need. This is what people need to understand. Vet your information and vet your sources.
And vet your medical professionals. I have no problem with that. Also, one more thing. Skepticism is great, but not everybody is out to get you. You don't want to go the other way either. Like everything is bad. All doctors suck and all that.
That's where we are right now.
That's where you are right now.
When every scientist is out to make money. There are other ways to make a killing financially than being a scientist. I can promise you that. I know plenty of people that I worked with in labs that are not making millions of dollars. That's really not what's going on here. And by the way, let me just talk to you for a second. This notion that this is a big worldwide scandal and a fake, this COVID thing, I have to just say this. You are now looking at the insurrectionists out there saying to people, it's a good thing you caught me when you did, because you'd be arresting me for something else. Nobody can keep their mouth shut for that long when there's a conspiracy. And there's not a conspiracy involving every nation in the world and millions of people. Okay? All right?
By the way, I don't know if I said this. I'll end on this. There are real world and real life implications from Theranos still. Number one, even though she doesn't own the patents anymore, there are patents out there that she helped develop, some with Ian Gibbons and, some were her own, especially the trademark, blood device thing. Just because you have a patent doesn't mean it works. Okay. It just means that you apply for a patent.
Paper.
It works on paper. Right. So she doesn't own any of these patents anymore. She sold them to a company. Some of these, they're talking about applying them towards COVID. So that's one. The second is this law that she enacted in Arizona. I don't know if other states looked at this and said, hey, this is a good idea. So just because, and of course, there's the effect on the investors and the effect on patients. I looked for wrongful death. It would be very difficult for someone to directly connect wrongful death to that. But there were reports, cease and desist reports on the lab saying that this will eventually cause injury and death.
It would.
A million labs thrown out from like a 2-year period. You think that people weren't adversely affected from that? Again, not only health-wise, but imagine I mentioned that some of these people were told to go to the emergency rooms. How many of those people who were told to the emergency rooms were poor, couldn't afford to go to the emergency room, but went anyway, and then went and it got hurt financially? You know, even if it was $100, $200, $300, whatever it was, you know, think of it that way.
Yep.
So there was a practical thing that people don't think about with this stuff. So business, you know, there was business and there was harm to the consumer. So to me, I'm more worried about harm to the consumer, but I think that she's going to get popped on the investor part, which is fine, because maybe, just maybe, as John Carreyrou did say, even though he talks about noble cause corruption, he did say she needs to go to jail, because Silicon Valley or the startups need to be put on notice that you can't stretch the truth to that degree, because if she gets away with it,
then everybody else gets away with it.
Then everybody gets away with it. I'm going to end with that.
All right, guys. So I'm going to get going so I can get this together and get it posted tomorrow morning early before I go to work.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Thanks for waiting. Won't happen again. Maybe not. I'll talk to you later.
10,001 times.
Stop the recording right now. Okay.
One thing I forgot to mention, I haven't read it yet, but Deb has. Bad Blood by John Carreyrou. Check it out.
Really good book.
I'm gonna check it out. I haven't yet, I have to admit, but he goes into more detail. Again, just another source for you.
Yep. Good book.
Thanks, guys.
Okay.